Today we will be demonstrating how to set up the Servo I for patients on mechanical ventilation. First, I would like to start off by just going through some of the external features of this ventilator. So this Servo I comes with a tower that's supplied by Mackay. First of all, I'd just like to show where is the on-off power switch. It's actually located at the back of the screen. There's this little flap that you can actually push down and you can turn to the on and off position. Right. At the back, there's also a lever here that's used to actually adjust the screen up and down. On this side is where the inspiratory inlet and the expiratory exhaust is. So this is where we actually connect the inspiratory and expiratory limb of the patient circuit. Hooked to the top is actually a gas tubing that is actually needed for us to do the pre-set up test. And at the bottom we have several modules where we can actually add the features to the ventilator, as well as adding in the extra batteries. So for the screen itself, you can actually press this lever to actually tilt it to the left and right. There's a cover at the lower end to actually protect some of the buttons, dial that actually you can use to adjust a certain patient ventilator. The screen itself is a touch screen augmented by buttons at the side. The other side is where the gas hose as well as the power cable is actually connected. Make sure that we do not have anything that is actually blocking the exhaust hose. Okay, with that, that's all for the external features of the Servo I. So before we put the Servo I on the patient, we need to do the pre-test. Alright, so when you wake this patient up, ventilator up from the standby mode, they will have a prompt to actually tell you that whether you want to do a pre-use check as well as a patient circuit test. So we will start with the pre-use check. Press the button to activate. Confirm that we want to start the pre-use check. Right. So your ventilator should come with a gas tubing. Okay, this gas tubing is actually used as part of the pre-use check. What you need to do is to actually install the gas tubing into the inspiratory as well as the expiratory limb. Make sure that it's tightly screwed in. Once that is done, they will actually detect. Alright, so this is the part where they will ask you to disconnect. So I've actually switched off the power supply. And then they're asking you to restart the power supply. And now is the part where we connect the patient circuit. So at this time point, you will take out the gas tubing, right, and connect the inspiratory limb with the bacterial filter to the inspiratory inlet, and then the expiratory exhaust with the HEPA filter pre-installed. Make sure that both are very, very tight and there's no leak. And they also ask you to put in the block at the wide connector. Once that is done, you just press OK. Now the instruction is whether we want to compensate for compressible volume. We will always put yes. So now that you have said that the pre-use check has passed, you just click OK. And they will pop up a screen that is asking you whether you want to erase the previous user setting. If this is for a new patient, you just put yes. And once that is done, you'll be ready to set the settings for the new patient. So now we are ready to set up the Servo I on a patient that's mechanically ventilated. This is the standby screen. At the start, you have options to put the patient on the invasive or non-invasive ventilation. So for this particular scenario, we are highlighting the invasive ventilation. So when you click on it, it will turn white. You can then set the mode for the invasive mechanical ventilation, and this option is on the top, the left-hand corner. When you press it, you will get the various modes that is already preloaded into the software of the system. So for this particular machine, there's volume control, pressure control, PS/CPAP, which is the pressure support equivalent on other ventilator, as well as SINV, either in volume or pressure control. So for this particular example, we'll be using the volume control. When that is pressed, you'll be able to set various variables. Because this is volume controlled, we are allowed to actually let the ventilator know what volume we are targeting. So this is similar for any other patients when we are initiating mechanical ventilator. The appropriate initial setting would be about 6 to 8 mils of ideal body weight. And you can adjust it by pressing down on the button and turning the blue dial at the side. Once you are comfortable with the volume, you can press down on the dial to lock it in. You can also use the dial to actually go to the different components, different variables, or you can just touch the screen itself to select the specific buttons that you want to choose. Right? So for patient respiratory rate, we can set it close to what the patient was breathing prior to the intubation. Next, we have the PEEP. All right. Generally, we start with at least a PEEP of 5 for most of our patients. The inspired O2, we can also dial it up. I would suggest that we'll start off with 100% oxygen. At certain point, they will actually pop up an alarm which tells you that this is a relatively high setting. You can still continue to go up by continuing turning the dial to the level of oxygen that you want. Once you are happy, press down on the dial to select it. In this Servo I, the inspiratory to expiratory ratio, you can actually control it by adjusting it directly. All right? But note that these numbers may be changed when relative to the frequency as well as the volume that you set. For example, even though I put a ratio of 1:3, if my respiratory rate goes up very, very high, which means that the total respiratory cycle is very, very short, and the absolute expiratory time you can infer by looking at the top right-hand corner. The ventilator actually gives you information about what is the inspiratory time. T-pause is the time that the ventilator will have an inspiratory hold after a breath is being delivered. In volume control, we generally tend to keep the inspiratory time, the pause, to be 0. Rise time is related to how fast this breath is being delivered. General setting to start off with is 5%, and you can increase every incremental about 5% each. Trigger is how the ventilator will be able to sense whether a patient is about to take a breath. It can, in this particular setting, this is in flow, and typical start off point would be about 2 to 3. As your trigger. All right. Once everything is set, you are happy with the setting, just press accept, and you go back to the standby mode. Once you're ready to put this patient on a mechanical ventilator, you just need to press the standby button at the bottom left-hand corner, right? And the ventilator will start delivering the breath to the patient. Okay, so we have set our initial setting for the patient, and the patient is connected to the ventilator, and the ventilator is delivering the required settings. So now let's look at the interface proper. So the Servo I has a touch-based screen with buttons at the side to enable the quick access. In terms of its layout, the majority of the screen is actually manifests as the waveforms. This allows us to actually review the waveform to look for any features of desynchrony. At the bottom, you have access to some quick settings where you can actually make adjustments without going into the main menu. And so depending on what mode you are, you will have access to settings like the delivered oxygen, PEEP, respiratory rate, as well as the delivered tidal volume in volume control. You can make a quick adjustment by lifting up the cover and just turning the dial, all right, to the desired level that you want. You do not really need to press any accept button, and you will be the changes will be made instantly. Alternatively, you can press down on the main control and adjust it through the main menu. Okay. On the right hand side of the screen, there will be a column of parameters. These are actually the measured parameters detected from the patient, and they are color coded depending on the categories. In yellow are the pressures. You will notice that they will give you the peak airway pressure as well as the mean and the PEEP pressure. On the corner, you will see that there are smaller numbers. These are actually the upper limit and lower limit of alarm setting. So when there's an issue with the patient's breath, any alarms will be reflected up by a blinking light, and you also see messages coming across. For example, let's demonstrate an error message. So you can hear the alarm. Right now, what is reflected here is the peak airway pressure is very, very high, and that is reflected by the blinking red light, as well as a message to tell you what is the problem. All right, so to go back to the patient, examine the circuit, and then correct it on the ventilator. So to silence the alarm, you just need to press the top right hand button. All right. On the left hand corner, besides this information, you also have information about the oxygen sensor, how much oxygen is detected, the respiratory rate of the patient, as well as the volume in tidal volume, as well as a minute ventilation. You can have access to additional parameters by touching on the additional values, and that will give you other parameters such as the auto PEEP measurements, and if you press one more, you have another layer of information such as the compliance and resistance of the circuit. You can always press the main screen to go back to the original interface that you see here. After you have set the patient, very often we also need to adjust the alarm profile. This will give the ventilator the limit, the upper and lower limit of when it should sound out to the care provider. So when you press the alarm profile, you'll go into this screen, and you can actually make the adjustments for things like the pressure, minute volume, respiratory rate, as well as the N-expiratory, the pressure. And you can make adjustments to the limit by pressing the button and then adjusting the dial and pressing down to select. To go back to the main screen, you just have to press the main profile again. All right. So you also notice that when the patient is trying to make a spontaneous effort and is triggering of the ventilator, there's a little T icon that will be shown on the screen. So that will tell you that this is a triggered breath because the patient is trying to breathe. If this is a mandated breath, then the T sign will disappear. Okay, in this segment, we will demonstrate respiratory maneuvers that you can do to understand more about the patient's lung mechanics. The two common respiratory maneuvers are an inspiratory hold as well as an expiratory hold, looking at the plateau pressure as well as the total PEEP respectively. In order to activate the maneuvers, first of all, you need to go to the parameter screen that will actually reflect what pressure that you want to measure. So for example, in inspiratory hole, you want to look at plateau pressure. So once you are in that screen, you can press the inspiratory hole button located at the bottom right hand corner. As you press, the patient, the ventilator will actually induce an inspiratory hole, and the plateau pressure will be reflected on the screen. Okay, if you want to do an expiratory hole, looking at the total PEEP, similarly, you go to the screen that actually will reflect the plateau, the total plateau pressure. The expiratory hole button is just next to the inspiratory hole, and as you activate, the pressure will equalize, and you will see that the total PEEP is 5, which is similar to the set PEEP. So this patient do not have a significant auto PEEP issue. Alright. Lastly, for nursing who require to do toileting for the patient, such as suctioning, you can pre-oxygenate the patient by assessing the suction support. Once that is pressed, the ventilator will deliver 100% oxygen, right? And the patient and nurses can proceed to do the airway suctioning for the patient.